Hi, my name is Brian Beebe and I'm a master naturalist. I like to get out into the woods, see flowers, see trees, and kill those invasives. Plants. You think plants are green. That's what you think of when you think of plants, the color green. This plant doesn't have any green, but it is a plant and it is not a mushroom. This is the flower for a plant. Can you guess what the plant is?
My name is Dennis Johnston. I'm Director of Parks for Harris County Precinct 4. I started my career 38 years ago this month as a volunteer on a piece of property along the Spring Creek Greenway called Jesse H. Jones Park and Nature Center, which you see right there. Jones Park was one of the properties that was purchased by then County Judge John Lindsay. And Judge Lindsay was purchasing these properties using land and water conservation funds from the federal government. And he was purchasing these properties in what he termed as the Cypress Creeks Parks Project. And if you look on some of the old key maps today, well, even the new key maps still list some of these properties as Cypress Creeks Parks Project. And some of those properties included, one of those properties included Jesse Jones. And there is a plaque in the Jesse H. Jones Park and Nature Center playground picnic area that denotes the land and water conservation funding that helped buy it. So that was one of the early properties that he bought. There were several more along Spring and Cypress Creek, mostly along Spring Creek, that he purchased during the late 1970s and through the early 80s with this Land and Water Conservation Fund money. He continued to do that until the fund kind of dried up, and then the property sat there for a long time. These properties sat undeveloped for so long that most people just kind of forgot about them. I was the director of Jones Park. I spent a lot of time also in this area across the creek, which was, at that time, none of this development was in here. This was 20,000 acres of undeveloped property on the other side of the creek, most of which belonged to Bender heirs. Mr. Eugene Bender had a sawmill down here in Humble at 1960 and 59, and he bought a lot of these properties up along Spring Creek and up the San Jacinto River to fuel his timber mill. And he would float them down the river, float them down the creek, and a horse and mule team would pick them up at Highway 59 and carry them to the sawmill. And he used his profits to buy more lands. He, being of German descent, believed that you should never sell your property, that it should be passed down to your heirs. That kind of kept large chunks together for a long time. Commissioner Eversole and I sat down one day. They made me director in 2004. We had a canoe trip with Commissioner Chance over here on the Montgomery County side. And we paddled down Spring Creek, and the statement was made by Commissioner Eversole that, hey, we can't look at one side of the creek paddling down here. We need both sides. So Commissioner Chance, who was Precinct 3 Commissioner on the Montgomery County side, said, hey, we'll partner up here and we'll start to work together to try to buy these properties on both sides of the creek as best we can. We can create this linear park almost to I-45, from Jones to I-45, and that was kind of the initial kickoff goal. We put in here at Punt Park, and we paddled down to Jones Park and pulled out there at Jones Park, but that was the kickoff in 2004 that reignited the Greenway project, formerly known as the Cypress Creek Parks Project. The two sides are now working together. Of course, nobody had all the money it would take to buy this at that point in time, and we still don't today. So we look for different tools in the box to work with partners, to work with grants. Texas Parks and Wildlife was a great grant partner in this whole project. They gave several grants to help purchase land and build trail systems and bridges along this segment between Jones Park and Punt Park was the first trail segment. So all this started coming together when Commissioner Cagle took over. And Commissioner Cagle came in, I think around around 2009-ish, 2010. He saw a huge value in this project. And I like to equate his description of how this thing would be built. He talks about the great cathedrals of Rome and how it took generation after generation to complete some of these massive projects. And he looks at the Greenway the same way, that it may not get finished in his and my lifetime, but it will get finished sooner or later by future generations. And the project took on its own life from that point forward. It expanded dramatically. So we were originally talking about Jones Park to Punt Park. It expanded from Highway 69 to 45, and then it expanded from the Kingwood Trail system over here, which you see these pink lines on the map. There's over 100 miles of trails in Kingwood already, and if we can link to them, and we're working on that with the Houston Parks Board to make that connection happen. And then you have the Woodlands over here on this segment with over 200 miles of trails already on the ground. So we link to that segment. We have 300 miles of trails plus the Greenway is the linkage, connecting all this together. Instead of the original, 13, 17, 33, 44 miles. And probably will go beyond that. So, in a nutshell, we put together a group of individuals on the Harris County side with the flood control, with the recreation, and the component of this Spring Creek Greenway that often gets lost, and you will appreciate this as a Texas master naturalist, is the wildlife corridor. We often lose that. People don't think about that benefit. I'll tell you an interesting story. One weekend, I took the family up to Canyon Lake to see the eagles. Mm-hmm. I think we paid $50 a head or something to get on that boat out there. It was ridiculous. And we traveled around the lake and never saw a single eagle. The next weekend, I came back here and I guided a canoe trip out of Jesse Jones down here to 59. It was just a short little 2-hour trip when we were pulling out there. And we came around this bend where the two creeks come together, and there's an osprey trying to rip the tail feathers out of a bald eagle. And they're fighting, wow. and they would come together 100 yards up, latch onto one another, and fall almost to the water, and then split apart, and then come and do it again. It was the wildest thing I've ever seen. We had one lady, who absolutely told us, bring the body bags if you're going to buy my property, because you're not coming through here with a trail. We worked with her. We took her out on the existing trails. We've shown them the benefits of the trail. She was all about the wildlife, and we didn't know that. She didn't really know what we were doing other than a trail system. But once we took her down here and showed her what we were doing and explained that without this corridor, what's left? The wildlife you can't just segment wildlife on your 35 acres. So the connectivity, the wildlife corridor connectivity clicked, and you could see the light go off in her eyes. And she became turned 180 degrees and said, I get it, I'll sell you the property. So we've had a couple of those along the way that have you know, had that stick in the mud scenario, and you know, it's just, you have to explain, you have to show them. And that's the great thing about having the trail built from 45 to 69, because we can take folks down there. We can show them. We can put them on the trail. We can show them the NIMBY factor here, not in my backyard. Well, look at this trail, goes right along behind a lot of subdivisions. And a lot of those people had the same idea when we first built the trail, that it was just going to bring crime to their backyards. But after the trail was built, they changed their tune completely. Some of it, many of them that abut the greenways, the value of their homes went up because now you had instant access, and many of them asked, can I put a gate directly from my house into the Greenway project? And they use it every day. So, you know, when you add that components together, the recreation, the wildlife, and then the flooding, you know, the flooding speaks for itself. But these natural areas that are wooded, they become like the sponge, the kidneys of our watersheds. If you look at, and if you don't believe me, just take a look at some of the bayous around Houston, where developers have come in, built right up to the edge of the bayou, and then flood control had to come behind them, channelize the bayous, pour concrete in the bottom, and try to make that work. And that only works some of the time in some of the places. You know, there's no guarantees there either. But here, if we can give the creek some elbow room and let it flow out and flow back in, let it flow through the trees. I mean, at Jones Park, when we have a flood down there, I pulled off well over 100 truckloads of sand that would normally have been washed down into Lake Houston, but was pushed into the woods and the trails here at Jones Park out of the creek. You know, that's siltation. That's being captured by the wooded areas. That's your kidneys. That's your filtration system occurring when you have those giant floods. So, you know, there are definitely larger greenway systems developing out there. We're not the biggest, but greenways are a big thing. I mean, trails, the great thing about trails is they appeal to anyone from 8 to 80. Mm-hmm. You know, what else can you build that hits every age group like that?
This is a coral root orchid. It does not use photosynthesis to feed itself. It acts more like a mushroom and eats off leaf litter and tree bark that has died and fallen on the ground. It's not a rare plant, but it is not found very often. You'll find it on the forest ground. This one was near Jesse Jones Park.
Hey everybody, my name is Suzanne Simpson. I'm the Land Stewardship Director with Bayou Land Conservancy, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the Spring Creek Nature Trail. Spring Creek Nature Trail, if you haven't learned already, is a 14-mile natural surface trail that runs along Spring Creek in both Montgomery and Harris counties. And the reason that this trail was conceived is it responded to needs arisen by the community for more access to the natural spaces that Spring Creek has to offer. Now, you guys may have already learned about the Spring Creek Greenway Trail. The difference about the Spring Creek Nature Trail is that it is completely natural surface. So it's a true wilderness experience, and that's the constituency that we really wanted to lean into, was the people that wanted a nature experience where you could get into the middle of a forest and almost feel like you were lost, no longer in the middle of Houston. Hopefully not literally lost. We have signposts to help with that. So what happened was in 2014, Bayou Land Conservancy took over a grant from the Greater Houston Off-Road Biking Association, and we began the planning process of the Spring Creek Nature Trail. And it was a multi-partner effort because Bayou Land Conservancy doesn't own one stitch of land that the Spring Creek Nature Trail runs over. Now, what was crucial to planning, building and maintaining the Spring Creek Nature Trail were our volunteers. I remember working with John Stacy and other master naturalists from the Heartwood chapter to help mark the trail in 2015. And in 2015, Spring Creek had a bank-full event where the water went out of its banks and it spread out all over the floodplain. And I remember thinking while we were marking the trail, I'm really glad we're marking this now because it's never going to rain like this again. And then we had Tax Day, Memorial Day, and Hurricane Harvey. So luckily, because we put the trail in more of the upland areas of Spring Creek and more of like the peripheral transitional areas of Spring Creek, the trail was actually very sustainably designed so that whenever we do have these big flood events, it provides room for the water to move in without washing the trail back out. Now, believe it or not, because of where our funding source started with the trail, we had to get it approved by the Texas Department of Transportation. It took a little while, but eventually our little trail got the signal of approval. We had an archaeological study done on it, which was incredibly interesting. We found things like arrowheads. There weren't any settlements that we needed to move the trail around, but it was really fulfilling to see that the Spring Creek, the area that the Spring Creek Nature Trail was going over had been utilized by tribes like the Akakisa Indians as hunting reserves. So as we began to build the Spring Creek Nature Trail, these things always seem to happen during the summer. We have interns and volunteers that were out with us in June, July, and August, snipping and clipping through thick thickets of yopons. Most of those interns have never been heard from again. Eventually, we were able to create the trail, all 14 miles of it, and through that creation, our volunteers dedicated 2,500 hours of service in creating the Spring Creek Nature Trail. Many of these volunteers are master naturalists in either the Heartwood or Gulf Coast chapter. Now, after the trail was finally created, we were able to open it on June 1st, 2018. And it's been a special trail ever since, but it was especially crucial to our neighborhoods during the coronavirus pandemic when everything else was shut down. People were able to reconnect to what really matters to them, which turns out is simple things like riding a bike with your family, taking nature walks, having school outdoors, engaging with the wildlife and the nature that's there to be protected forever, thanks to Bayou Land Conservancy and our partners. So I hope you enjoy the Spring Creek Nature Trail's history. I hope you're able to get out on the Spring Creek Nature Trail at some point in Houston. And I really hope that you enjoy yourself while you're learning about the Spring Creek Greenway. It's an extremely special place to me. It's an extremely special place to our volunteers. And now that the trail has been open for 2 years, I want to emphasize volunteers have been key here. They have just eclipsed the 3,000 hour mark of volunteer service on the Spring Creek Nature Trail. So we want to thank our volunteers, we want to thank our landowner partners, and our multi-agency partners that have helped make this trail a reality in our community.
Here's a flower doing what it does best, feeding other wildlife. Look at the ants eating the pollen off of this. Well, I'll let you guess. We'll tell you later.
The Spring Creek Greenway may be one long, contiguous corridor, but to truly understand how it came to be and how it continues to grow and develop, one must regard it for what it truly is, a collection of individual properties bound together by a partnership of landowners and stakeholders. The major players in this partnership include Montgomery County, Harris County, the Woodlands Development Company, the Woodlands Township, and Bayou Land Conservancy. Each of these organizations has an interest in the preservation of green spaces for the sake of current and future generations. This interest is the common thread that runs through every endeavor we undertake. While each partner contributes in their own way, the three main pillars of the partnership are land conservation, projects, and outreach. Land conservation is what makes places like the Greenway possible in the first place. Land trusts, like the Bayou Land Conservancy, can give landowners an incentive to protect their lands and offer a framework in which to do so. In fact, the very first conservation easement between a county and a land trust in the state of Texas was between Montgomery County and BLC. That first agreement created the Montgomery County Preserve. At just over 70 acres in size, that first modest preserve eventually gave rise to a number of other preserves covering hundreds of acres of land owned by Montgomery County. Projects along Spring Creek are usually designed to fill one of two goals: protecting and restoring the conservation value of an area, or promoting the public's ability to access and enjoy green spaces. These projects are often completed by representatives and volunteers from two or more partners working together. Examples of conservation projects would include the removal of invasive species like Chinese tallow, or the river cane propagation project, an effort to introduce native river cane to the Houston area using cuttings from the aforementioned Montgomery County Preserve. A great example of an access and enjoyment project is the Spring Creek Nature Trail, which runs through land belonging to every major landowner along the Greenway, with construction and maintenance provided by BLC ambassadors. Outreach and public education are vital to the continuing effort to preserve our green spaces. Helping people to connect with nature and understand the importance of what we do garners support for our cause within the community. We largely have the same message, even if we deliver it in different ways. In fact, it's these differences that help to reinforce our message. When the Woodlands Township holds an Earth Day event, the Nature Center shows up with animals to demonstrate the impact our actions can have on wildlife. When BLC does their No Child Left Inside program, Harris County lends them a pond for dip netting so the kids can see an aquatic ecosystem up close and in great detail. When an organization like the Texas Master Naturalists approaches us to participate in a video showcasing what we have to offer, we all come together and share what makes our little corner of Texas so special. It can sometimes be difficult to bring together so many prominent groups for something as large as the Spring Creek Greenway, but all the things we have been able to accomplish together stands as a testament to how worthwhile such an endeavor can be. This room houses our collection of live animals that we have on display, also known as our animal ambassadors. Let's take a look around. In this tank here we have 2 live alligators on loan from Brazos Bend State Park. They're named Cypress and Tupelo. Over here we have what we call our pond tank. We basically have a collection of different animals that you would find out in our bluegill pond on the preserve. Some of our more prominent residents are the soft-shell turtle and the largemouth bass, who is currently in the back. This enclosure here in the corner houses our eastern screech owl. Her name is Pepper. She came to us from a local wildlife rehabilitator, the Friends of Texas Wildlife. The reason that she is kept in captivity even after her recovery is because she sustained injuries that would prevent her from being able to survive on her own in the wild. We also have a large collection of reptiles, mainly consisting of snakes. We are working on expanding our collection, but for right now, we have a good number of snakes on display. Our collection does include 3 venomous snakes, 2 of which are readily found here in the Spring Creek area. We've got a copperhead. His name is Hershey, named after the Hershey's Kisses shaped markings on the side. We also have a cottonmouth, or a water moccasin, and his name is Inigo Montoya. Our third venomous snake is, Our third venomous snake is the eastern black-tailed rattlesnake. Her name is Sonora. They are actually found farther west, even out west of Austin. One of the more recent additions to our animal ambassadors is a cane toad named Pirate. You can see him sort of back there in the back of this enclosure. So this is not a native species, but he came to us from a fellow nature educator who was no longer able to keep him. And the cane toad is the largest toad species in the world, and they're actually found down in Central and South America. Is one of our more popular residents, and she actually has a little bit of a social media following. Her name is Colonel Honey Dijon Mustard III. She is a bearded dragon, and she is a voracious eater. She is definitely food motivated. In fact, she probably expects to get some food right now in exchange for being taken out of her cage, but it's not feeding time yet, so I'm sorry. But the reason why we have her, bearded dragons are not a native species to the area. Unfortunately, we found her out on one of our nature preserves. Someone had her as a pet, but they apparently didn't want to keep her anymore, and instead of doing the responsible thing by taking her back to where they got her, or to a pet store, or finding a new home for her, they just abandoned her outside. Now, being native to the desert areas of Australia, that's not a good idea. We found her just before wintertime, and if she had stayed out for too much longer, she probably would not have made it. But she's doing pretty good now. Like I said, she has no problems eating, so she's obviously no worse for wear. I think we got to her just in time. Here, eat your salad. We also have a couple of other new additions to the Nature Center. We've got a pair of ring-necked doves named Peach and Pumpkin. And they're fairly used to people being around, so they don't freak out much or anything. Eventually we plan to use them for education events and being able to interact with a bird. Whereas we're not really ever going to be able to use our screech owl for interactions. These guys are, they're going to be just fine.
This is a pink lady. Can you see why they call it a pink lady? What a gorgeous flower. This is perhaps my favorite. You may find me cheating with another flower because they're often very beautiful flowers, but I love pink ladies.
Hi, I'm Aram Darowetsky and this is Lori Shenzing, and we're both geologists. I'm a sedimentary geologist, which means that I look at sand, silt, and mud that's deposited by wind and water. And we're here in the Spring Creek drainage looking at some beautiful sedimentary features that we can impart on people who are using the facilities.
We're standing in front of an oxbow lake here, which we'll talk a little bit more about how this type of feature is formed. And we'll show you quite a few other different geological features.
So one of the slight mysteries that we have on the Spring Creek acreage is the fact that the Spring Creek is actually cutting into the underlying sediments. It's incising and creating what's called an incised valley. So on this side, I have a very steep cut, and it's about 15 feet, about 4 or 5 meters down. And if you look at the other side, you can see a couple of things. You can see one of these bars that's forming on the slow side of the river. And you also see that the river is about 5 meters lower, or the land is about 5 meters lower on that side, where it would flood out. And so we're not sure exactly why it is, but there are a few hypotheses that we have to suggest what's going on here. One of the hypotheses is that we're getting a little local uplift. Maybe something's going on with respect to the regional tectonics, and the stuff is cutting through. Another is there are a series of faults in the Gulf on the continental shelf, and they go out, and there's actually faults in Houston, and those faults are all slipping down towards the Gulf of Mexico, creating what we call accommodation, which allows this to cut down into pre-existing sediment and to redeposit it in the Gulf of Mexico.
So here's an example where the Texas Master Naturalists and our trail crew have worked to create a new trail to move this trail in because of that erosion that Aram was just talking about along the Spring Creek. So you could see that we have, and as we go, it goes in even further, about 20 to 30 feet.
Yeah, and you can actually see how this water oak is starting to tilt. You can see behind it there's a couple of loblolly pines that are also losing the battle with erosion, and they're going to wind up in the creek soon. We're here at the Steel Bridge, which is the only major bridge that crosses Spring Creek as a trail bridge. And we're seeing some really nice features of this small river system. We call it Spring Creek, but it's actually a small river. It flows all year round. And what we're seeing down here are a series of sandbars. And technically they're called point bars. And these are what I would call an ephemeral feature. That means that they don't persist. They actually migrate downstream, and that's one of the ways that the sediment is being drawn from this area down into the Gulf of Mexico.
Important thing to point out here is that this is the only place that Spring Creek actually runs north-south. So that metal bridge was put there specifically. So it generally trends west to east. However, right here it takes a northerly turn. And so that way you have a lot of this pressure being taken on right here, which is why the bridge was put up there, because then you're slowing down the flow. So here's a great example of the cut bank over here, and then you have the point bar depositing here. So the flow is stronger on that side and you're depositing on this side.
So it actually takes away.
Takes it, you can see it cutting in, it's eroding out that side of the bank, hence the word, hence the name cut bank. And then you have your point bar, your depositional structure over here. And you can also see some of the ripple marks, which are classic examples of slower flow.
The ripples, and we see a series of these ripples in here, and ripples can be in several different forms. They're like little sand dunes that are formed underwater. And I don't know if the camera can see this, but in here, the sand is much coarser than up here, because the velocity is higher in this portion of the ripple than it is in this. So the ripples are migrating in this direction towards the water, and as the velocity decreases, the sand starts to come out. Another very interesting thing that we're seeing here is this is evidence of life. Maybe a worm or an insect has been burrowing through this sand, probably just to get from one place to another, but it may be eating some of the detritus within the sand. These are called traces, and if this gets lithified, turned into a rock, we would call this a trace fossil. It's evidence of past life, and this is evidence that the creek is colonized and that the creek is actually fairly healthy. And if we go and take a look right over here, you can see one of the types of dunes or ripples is called a lunate ripple, and it looks like a moon or a half moon shape. And we can see how the water is coming over and it spills down here. So it comes up, it's a very shallow, and then it gets steep, shallow, steep. That tells us that the water is moving in this direction. Of course, we can see that in modern water, but if this was something from 100 million years ago, we would use that as evidence of the direction of flow of the current. Here we have a surface of gravel that's formed, and this is during the highest water velocities. You get gravel that is entrained in the sediment. This gravel is an example of what's called bed load. So this is sediment, coarse sediment. These would eventually make a conglomerate. This coarse sediment is being drawn along the bottom of the creek as called traction. So it's just bouncing along the bottom of the creek. As the velocity goes down, these will drop out, and you'll have the sand being deposited. And the sand is deposited as traction load, or it can also be as saltation. And saltation forms when the grains are picked up by the current and dropped back down again with sufficient velocity to knock a couple of additional grains up into the current. And it's sort of like hopping down the creek. So that's another means of transportation. The other thing we can see that there's this point bar is being formed out into the creek, and you have a series of smaller subsidiary bars that are forming with channels in between them. So I'll try to keep myself from going into the quicksand, but I'm on a bar form right here. So there's the first one. That's where the highest velocity is, and this is the next one. This is another bar form. And as I come out into the creek, there's a little channel right here, and then another bar form in here. And this is the highest velocity portion of the creek. This is what This is the highest velocity portion of the creek. Thank you. It doesn't work when I'm talking to the creek. And this would be called the thowweg of the river system, where the highest velocity portion of the creek is. That's where you get the most erosion and the least deposition. So you're getting more and more deposition coming this way and less as you go over into here. There's a mixture of different kinds of sediments that form this area, the Spring Creek drainage. And there's a lot of sand. It's a very sand-rich system, but there's also a fair amount of clay. And you can tell the clay for two reasons. One is it's got an orange color to it, so it's high in iron. And the other way to do it is to take a little piece of the wet sediment, roll it out, and then bend it. And if it doesn't break when you bend it, then it has a very high clay content. So this could actually be used to make pottery.
Whenever the elevation of the water elevation in Spring Creek gets above 111 mean sea level, the water will actually start to flow east here. So it'll flow this way. So as long as it's below, it always will flow west into the creek. And then at that point, anything above 111.
So this is basically an oxbow that's in the process of forming. So it hasn't completely been abandoned by the mainstream, but mostly it has. One of our colleagues, Don, just mentioned that as of 3 years ago, this was the main channel in the creek, and because this is an active system, there's another side channel that comes through here, and it cut through, creating an incision that allowed the creek to start to flow in a different area. And so this is an abandoned channel, and eventually it'll turn into an oxbow lake. One of the very interesting things about this is that you see a series of little gullies, little tiny gullies that are being formed here. These little gullies are formed as a result of an admixture of different kinds of sediment. And so the top sediment is fairly porous. That's going to be sand. And when rain hits it, that porosity allows it to infiltrate down until it hits a clay layer at the bottom, and then it starts to go out horizontally. And what that does is it causes stress to the sand above, and it collapses, and it nibbles away back to make these little gullies. This is called theater-headed gully erosion. It's a really cool example. There are giant examples of this. If you go to Utah, you go around Moab, there are these box canyons that are theater-headed gullies. And if you look at pictures of certain portions of Mars, you actually see very similar features, these theater-headed gullies, which are formed by the actions of sort of semi-arid wind and water. So one of the things that we're looking at is this disequilibrium system that we have here, where it's starting to cut down into pre-existing sediments. The sediment up here is what we call a soil, and there are different parts of the soil. There are different horizons, but this is a fairly complete soil horizon. And then it's cutting into, the creek was cutting into this before the soil horizon was established. This is actually fairly coarse sand that's being deposited here probably 1,000 years ago, a few thousand years ago, as this was being filled with sediment. And then we changed the equilibrium system, and we're starting to cut back down into it right now. So that's what's going on. We're going to see some really good examples of what's called a paleosol, which is an ancient soil, in a few minutes. As the stream, as the creek is starting to cut down into pre-existing sediments, it starts out with the most recent sediments, which are a few thousand years old or less. And you can see over on this side, that's the top layer of the soil. And as the creek is cutting down, it's cutting into more older soils. And this is what's called a paleosol, an ancient soil. This is probably at least 10,000 years old, and perhaps much older. You can see a bunch of red markings and then a bunch of holes in here. Those holes were formed by roots from a pre-existing forest. Maybe, like I said, maybe 10, 20,000 years ago. And then over here, you're actually getting precipitation around the roots of iron carbonate or iron sulfide or iron sulfate, like goethite or limonite. And so that's another example that's showing us that this was an ancient rooted horizon. And if we look behind over in this direction, we can see a very good example of this very dark humic soil. This very dark soil horizon, this is the modern soil horizon that's being cut into by the stream. Erosion and deposition. And why this is happening, we really don't know exactly, but it's a very interesting problem. If you look down here, you see a little pond, and it's a teardrop shape. And there's a blunt end and a sharp end. And this is formed by current flowing through here, creating a big standing wave right here, which erodes down into the pre-existing soil. It's called a cyclic step. The other thing to note is that this has got water in it, and so there's water in it because it's rained recently, but also because the water table is very shallow, and these cyclic steps tend to cut into the water table, and so we're at the top of the water table right here, and it is draining into the creek. This very large hole actually was formed first during the tax day flood, and then during Hurricane Harvey, when the Spring Creek had broken its banks. Water was traveling down the trail. There was a slight declivity, a slight depression here, and the velocity of the water was a little bit greater. It started to create what's called a standing wave. So you had the water coming through, and it created a wave in here, and that wave started to circulate and carve out this area here, which is a teardrop shape, which is sort of this hydrodynamic shape that forms this. And so eventually it starts to go, and it's got a shallow end and a deep end here. The shallow end is over here. The deep end is on the other side. Subsequently, after other smaller rain events, it started to get filled in. So if we take a look at my feet are on all this sand. This sand is being deposited as a series of small deltas that are prograding into this, this thing. We call these cyclic steps. Bring it a little closer. And these cyclic steps are formed as a result of slightly turbulent flow in these water zones. In this case, this excavation redeposited a bunch of sand as dunes downstream. These dunes are not very obvious. We'll go over and take a quick look, but they've been vegetated, so it's really difficult to see them, but you'll have to take my word for it. We're now on a series of dunes that are very sand-rich, and these are formed by the avulsion of the river, and it's as it reaches the levee, the sediment starts to drop out, and all through here there are a series of paddle-shaped dunes that are forming as a result of this sand dropping out of suspension in the river.
Invasive species. You may think I'm nuts bringing up these two beautiful flowers in the invasive species section. It's a blue flag iris with lizard tail, found in a swamp just behind Kingwood, Texas, almost within sight of the house's roofs. However, this is the way the swamp used to look. The next photo will show you what it looks like now.
Hello, my name is Monty Parks. I am a naturalist with Harris County Precinct 4, and I've studied the history of Spring Creek. We're going to talk about the Acokisa Indians who lived along Spring and Cypress Creek in North Harris County, going back at least to 100 AD. The Akokeses were a very primitive, true hunter and gatherer group that stayed in family units of 15 to 20 people. They used the creek and the waters for everything that they needed: food, fresh water, transportation. They spent winters along Spring and Cypress Creek, moving from place to place, gathering food. In the summertime, they would load their families up in dugout canoes and float the rivers and the creeks to Galveston Island and spend the summers there. The Akokeses were the first native tribe to contact European peoples around 1520 AD, when Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked along Galveston Island. He was held captive by the Akokeses in a village along Spring Creek. When he was reclaimed by the Spanish 7 years later, he wrote about the Akokeses and his time with them, and that's the first cultural references we have to them. Through his records and the records that came later from missionaries and French people, we know that the Akokeses used bear, deer, alligator, fish that were all found in plenty along Spring Creek. Their canoes were made from bald cypress trees, using fire and stone tools to shape them. They were long enough that they could fit 20 full casks in one canoe. They would load their families up and move along the creek, setting up temporary villages and temporary shelters all along the creek while they searched for food. That was a daily chore. They ate roots, berries, nuts, things that they could find, as well as hunting, fishing for meat. The Akokeses had very little contact with Europeans until about the 1800s, when the first Anglos arrived in Harris County. By that time, their numbers began to dwindle, and within 20 or 30 years of the Europeans living along Spring Creek, they ceased to exist as an independent body. The Akokeses were very peaceful. They were used by the French and the Spanish as intermediaries in trade between the two countries, in Spanish Texas and French Louisiana. They also were used as intermediaries between the Comanches and the Caddo Indians in East Texas. So they had a well-known reputation as being middlemen and traders, going back till probably 1400 AD. We know the Akokese were here through archaeological records. There have been multiple sites identified as Akokese sites along Spring Creek, both in the Harris County and the Montgomery County side. They also have found a large presence on Galveston Island at the Mitchell Ridge archaeological site in the 1970s. We found bone and stone tools. They found lots of pottery shards and other things. The Akokese had two items that were very hard to find that they used in trade all across North America. When they went to the coast, they collected asphaltum, that gooey black substance that comes up out of the Gulf of Mexico. They would trade that for use as glues. And also they were able to get red ochre from the ground all around this part of Texas, and they would trade that. That red ochre was very much used in tattooing by Native Americans all across the United States. They also were very good bow makers, and they would use the bodark trees and make bows. Some of those bows have been found all the way in California and all the way in the Great Lakes region of the United States. So we know that the trade that the Akokeses were doing for their three commodities, asphaltum, red ochre, and the bodark bows, went not just north and south, but also east and west. So these commodities were very important to them. They used them to trade for things that they didn't have. One of them being chert or flint to make arrowheads and spear tips. If they couldn't have flint or chert, obviously they had to use bone or stone for all of their tools and all of their hunting devices. So they were very good at gathering what they needed as well as what they had to trade. The Akokisas were 100% subsistent on the waters of northern Harris County. Spring Creek, Cypress Creek, the San Jacinto River. Without those bodies of water, the Akokisa would never have been able to survive, let alone thrive along the creeks. In the early 1700s, a group of Atakapa or Akokisa were captured on Galveston Island by a French ship and taken. 8 of them were taken back to New Orleans, where they were put on display. They were learned. They were talked about, and a lot of what we know about the Akokisa come from those 8 individuals who spent time with the French in New Orleans. Their language is one of the most well-recorded languages of all native peoples, and there is one example of an Akokisa in a painting by Alexander de Botts that was made in New Orleans during this period. And here is a photo of the painting.
Remember the photo of the beautiful blue flag iris with the lizard tail in the background? Nice little swamp. This is what the invasive have done to it. This is deep-rooted sedge, the same swamp, same place I took the photo of those beautiful native flowers. Invasives, we need to get rid of them.
Good morning. I'm Aaron Barowetsky again, and this time have been asked to talk a little bit about the avifauna, the birds around here. And one of the things about the Spring Creek Trail is it intersects a series of retention ponds to help with flood mitigation. And one of the results of that is we have the attraction of a bunch of really cool birds here. And it's a juxtaposition between the wetland and the forest habitats that really gives us a good place to do some stellar birding. And as a matter of fact, I'm listening, and I think I just heard a catbird in the background. I haven't seen one lately, but that would be a very interesting spot. The first set of birds that I want to talk about here are the wading birds that we have. We have a really nice, diverse assemblage of wading birds. We've got in the background a very pink bird, which is the roseate spoonbill. And along with that, we have a really nice flock of white ibises. And one of the beauties of the white ibises is they don't really care if we're here or not. You can get fairly close to them very often as they're foraging. In addition to that, there are 2 other white birds that we see very commonly. One with a yellow bill, that would be a great egret, and one with a black bill, and that's probably a snowy egret. You can tell the difference between the snowy egret and the cattle egret by their socks. The snowy egrets have yellow socks, or yellow feet, and the cattle egrets are solid black. In addition to this, we have very few ducks currently, but on occasion we get the black-legged whistling duck. And in addition to that, we have great blue herons and tricolored herons, which are very beautiful birds. So that's most of the wading birds that we see here. I'm sure that there are others. There are some cryptic birds that are not uncommon. You hear killdeer here on occasion, things like that. In the forest and the verge between the grassland and the forest, we see a lot of the usual suspects. We see cardinals, we see Carolina chickadees, Carolina wrens, tufted titmice, and birds like that. In addition, you very seldom see them, but you often hear them, are the white-eyed vireos, which have a very distinctive call, but they're quite shy, so they're hard to see. Recently I saw a Connecticut warbler, which is probably a migrant who's coming through, and so it's a really nice place to go birding. As a matter of fact, there are eagle sightings, bald eagle sightings periodically as well.
This is a plant. Yes, it's another plant that doesn't use chlorophyll. This plant is a carnivorous plant, but don't worry, it won't eat you. Do you know what it is?
Hi, my name is Peter Jensen, and I actually wear two hats. I wear the Bayou Land Conservancy hat, and I'm also a Texas Master Naturalist. I first got involved with the Bayou Land Conservancy in 2016 when I was still an employee with ExxonMobil, and I helped during the aftermath of the Tax Day and Memorial Day floods at the Spring Creek Greenway Nature Preserve. Well, that actually hooked me, so as I was approaching retirement in 2017, I knew I wanted to give back to the environment. So I looked up the Bayou Land Conservancy online, and I found they offered an ambassador course. So I was able to take the course, which introduced me to the trail crew, and the trail crew ultimately introduced me to the Texas Master Naturalist, because we have several people on the trail crew who are also Master Naturalists with the Heartwood chapter. Well, since that point in time, I've gotten involved with being a trail steward, a member of the Gala Committee, a conservation crew member, and along the Spring Creek Nature Trail where we are today, the trail is approximately 14 plus miles long, and each of those miles are broken up into segments, and trail stewards maintain or report out or walk the segments to ensure that we have clearance through there. So that's one aspect of it. The other part of the Spring Creek Nature Trail is there are 26 plus bridges and boardwalks along the whole trail. And earlier this year, we completed a 178-foot boardwalk which takes us through the Burroughs Park extension. That's the latest addition to the Spring Creek Nature Trail. So I've had the time of my life over the last 3 years contributing to the blazing and maintenance of the Spring Creek Nature Trail, and it's just been an incredible aspect of my retirement.
Okay, the Spring Creek Greenway is an ecotone, or an area where two ecoregions intersect and transition. So double the ecoregions means double the diversity. As the coastal prairie gives way to the piney woods, which is a dense, often wet, riparian forest, emerges in North Houston. Affectionately known as the Little Thicket, Appalachian species at the far western extent of their range intermingle with prairie and oak savanna species at the far eastern extent of their range. This creates unique interactions of these two communities and is one of the reasons the Little Thicket is part of the America's Ark. While yaupon and cherry laurel dominate the forest understories along Spring Creek, this was not always the case. Fire played an important role in suppressing woody overgrowth and allowing prairie grasses to grow on the forest floor. With the suppression of fire, many piney wood savannas have become overgrown, and invasive species like Chinese tallow, chinaberry, and others have gained a foothold. While nothing can truly replace fire as a management tool, controlling woody vegetation, including aggressive native species, is important to restore biodiversity to the forest.
This is our carnivorous friend, the sundew. If you look real closely, you can see the fly that's being dissolved by the sundew. It's that little black speck down towards the bottom. There's also the wing of something else further into the photo. The sundew traps the insects like mosquitoes. It will trap the insects and then slowly dissolve them. It's kind of neat.
Hello, I'm John Stacy. I'm also a Texas Master Naturalist, just like most of you. I belong to the Heartwood chapter. I also am active in the Bayou Land Conservancy as a volunteer. As a volunteer for the BLC, I've helped construct the Spring Creek Nature Trail here on the Greenway. We're at one of the special places. I know you'll see some other places on the trail, but this is one of my favorite places. Behind me, you see Spring Creek. Spring Creek, in many places, would be called a river. But here, it's the largest natural watercourse in the Houston area. As you can see, it's not been channelized, there's no concrete. It allows nature to do its thing. You can see we've got some low ground here. This is the floodplain. This is the natural place for the water to go when there's a flood or a high water event. The natural river course acts just like a buffer zone to absorb flood water, and in doing so, it creates habitat for all sorts of wildlife. It keeps the water temperatures and oxygenation just right for fish that we're used to around here. So it's a nursery for all kinds of creatures. In a way, human retention ponds are just a sorry imitation of what this floodplain does. You see, it bends, it meanders, it deposits silt, it builds up the bank, and then you get a flood and it cuts a brand new channel. So the river is alive. It's always changing. Mark Twain said something about only a fool can think he can control the river. But this change creates what's known as an oxbow lake. So we were looking at the stream and seeing how it meanders, and you could see the sandbar where silt and sand were deposited as the water slowed down. As the river does that, it's going to occasionally fill up the creek bed, and it'll blow out a new channel, and it'll leave behind an orphan. And these orphans are called oxbow lakes or oxbow ponds. And you have this lovely pond here that's no longer part of the river channel. Instead, it's still water. It's fed by, in our case, rainwater or high water events, but it is full of life. It has all of the vegetation that grows along the banks here. It becomes a nursery for everything from algae to bald eagles. So everything in between will grow here. It'll nurture in this still water. And then what do you know? We'll get another flood or something, and it will flush it back into the main channel, reinvigorating all the life there. And maybe one day there'll be a high water event, and the river will come right back through here and cut off the other channel, which will become an oxbow lake. Now, if that doesn't happen, it depends on the vegetation and the water, but this pond will last 25 to 50 years before eventually it would dry out enough to become a wetland. And again, it would be a very rich wetland because of the soil would be really rich from all the deposits over time. So oxbow lakes are a part of any river system that you can look at, the Mississippi to the little one in your neighborhood. But they're a huge part of the river ecology, and they're a huge part of what makes the Spring Creek Greenway a lovely place to come visit.
Can you guess what this white flower is? It's a tiny, tiny bunch of orchids going up a stalk. I'll give you a name for it in a minute.
Hi, my name is Carson Stokes. We're here on the Spring Creek Nature Trail on a nice, beautiful, rainy day. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've always been have a passion for nature. I've been a naturalist probably since I was 5 years old. But I ended up doing a lot of other things in my career. So I've had the luck of being able to find out about the Texas Master Naturalist Program, which I joined 7 years ago. And while I was doing work about that, I discovered another great organization called the Bayou Land Conservancy. In fact, they're the ones responsible for the trail that we're standing on right now. There's a lot of interesting different habitats here, but one of the ones I would like to talk about is called forested wetlands. Forested wetlands provide three main ecosystem services. They serve as stormwater buffers, absorbing the impact of high winds and holding floodwater before it reaches homes and businesses. They provide excellent habitat for endemic flora and fauna, and they filter pollutants from the water for free that will eventually make its way to our drinking glasses. In addition, forest wetlands serve as a valuable carbon sinks to offset emissions and slow down the forces of climate change. Some of the species that you're going to see in this video are adapted to partial inundation throughout the year. There will be what we call ephemeral pools that will only fill up after a heavy rain. You can sort of see one in the video. They're adapted to this, whereas plants used to living in more dry will not adapt, giving it a more open space look. And one of the other signal plants that indicates it's a forested wetlands is the palmetto, which you'll see in this video. Here we've got hornbeam, hop hornbeam. We have laurel, mountain laurels, water oak, and other species that have adapted to this particular type of ecosystem.
These are ladies' tresses. Take a look at the green stems which the white flower comes off from. The green stems are twisted just like ladies used to braid their hair.
Hey, I'm Suzanne Simpson. I'm the Land Stewardship Director for Bayou Land Conservancy. And one of the great volunteer opportunities that we have along the Spring Creek Greenway is the Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program. This program is open to nature lovers 16 and older, and it is a completely free 5-module nature training course that really takes you into the deep ecology of Spring Creek. It's sort of like if the Texas Master Naturalist program was just about one particular geographic area and went really deep into that part of the history. So it's going to talk a bit about the conception of the Spring Creek Greenway. It talks about some of the things that you're going to learn in the video today. And it also teaches you how to perform land management activities like trail maintenance in a way that is sustainable and helps work with nature. At Bayou Land Conservancy, we really believe that when done correctly, recreation and wildlife preservation and wetland conservation can work together in concert with one another and create co-benefits for our communities. So some of the lessons that we teach at the Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program are flora fauna, so helping you to ID what's in your backyard. We teach sustainable trail building practices. We go into our No Child Left Inside environmental education program. We teach people where to access the Spring Creek Greenway, where the trailheads are, how they can actually get onto the Greenway itself. We find one of the biggest barriers to access for people is that they just don't know where to go. They don't know where the nearest bathroom is. Those are the knowledge gaps that we're trying to fill through this program. And over its course, we've graduated hundreds of Spring Creek Greenway ambassadors that have helped us be the eyes, ears, and boots on the ground for the extent of the Spring Creek Greenway. Now, luckily, we have such an ambassador graduate with us here today. John Stacy is going to tell you a little bit more about his experience with the ambassador program.
As Suzanne said, I'm John Stacy. I'm a Heartwood Master Naturalist, and I think I went through the program in 2012. And since then, I've got about 2,800 hours officially logged. Of course, you Master Naturalists know that we always forget to log most of our hours, so who knows what I've really done. But I got involved with the Bayou Land Conservancy and the Ambassador Program after I finished the Master Naturalist class. Those of you who've become Master Naturalists know that it gives you a very broad introduction to Texas ecology, and it sort of makes you a jack of all trades. But I found the Ambassador Program was a means for me to drill down on an area that I was specifically interested in. Some people's interests are different. Maybe they want to go work on education or something. But I wanted to work on conservation efforts right here along the Spring Creek area. And the Ambassador Program was an ideal mechanism for me to do that. In fact, having gone through it, as many other Master Naturalists have done, I've ended up becoming an instructor in the program. So it's given me a chance to practice outreach, to reach different groups of people who are either new to the area or who in turn just want to learn about what's in their backyard. So I get to share my experience and some fun with very interesting people. And I found that that's the same with a number of the people who've gotten involved with the ambassador program. They too are master naturalists, or conversely, a lot of people who got into the program end up going through the Texas Master Naturalist program because they get intrigued by the opportunities. Some of which my friend here, Justin, presents to us.
My name is Justin Fausick. I'm the director of the Spring Creek Greenway Nature Center, and we actually work closely with both the Bayou Land Conservancy and the Texas Master Naturalist Heartwood chapter. Lots of opportunities. There's education, outreach, there's trail maintenance, service projects, even stuff like invasive species removal. And we're happy to partner with these organizations, especially with their volunteers, because they've been through the training, they've been through the process, they know what they're doing. I can feel comfortable having an ambassador or a master naturalist come out and help on these projects, because there's a certain level of quality assurance there that you wouldn't necessarily get with other people, just coming in to volunteer off the street. There's lots of great information and training that these guys have that really kind of synergizes with the stuff that we want to do, both improving the quality of the land that we have and also offering opportunities for other people to enjoy these outdoor spaces.
Yeah, and because of the Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program, we've been able to develop sort of subgroups of volunteer specialities. Some volunteers want to get out on preserves that aren't open to the public that we have to monitor annually, and so we've created the conservation crew to help with that. Other folks want to adopt a segment of the Spring Creek Greenway Nature Trail that really becomes theirs, and they monitor it monthly. And so we have the Spring Creek Nature Trail stewards that have created their own community through the Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program. So if you're in North Houston, if you're interested in North Houston, in this little place that we call the Little Thicket, please consider signing up for the Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program. It's offered twice a year, in the fall and the spring. You can find out more on Bayou Land Conservancy's website, which is www.bayouland.org. Click on Get Involved and Spring Creek Greenway Ambassador Program. Hope to see you in the next session.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed the session today. On behalf of all the volunteers who've worked on the Spring Creek Greenway and the Spring Creek Nature Trail, especially all you fellow master naturalists out there, this has been a blast. I think you ought to look into doing something like this for yourself, and it also goes really well with a cold beer.
If you visit the Spring Creek Nature Trail, be sure to download the Travel Stories app. That's travel and then stories, spelled S-T-O-R-Y-S. It's a free app from the App Store that'll give you a tour of the Spring Creek Nature Trail, tell you about the history, geology, some of the volunteer activities that you can get involved into as you're walking along at different points of the trail. Now, like John said, we think everybody should have a trail like this in their backyard. And if you're interested in learning more and you haven't gotten sick of John and I, we're going to be presenting on Saturday from 2 to 3 p.m. on building dirt trails, and you can learn how to build a trail like this in your neighborhood. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next time.